The plant site was large, 300 square miles. It included 6 small towns. Ellington was the largest. This is Castle's store in Ellington. Ellington was the largest with a population of some 600 people. This is the Dunbarton Cemetery, which was also on the site. Dunbarton had something like 280 people. All in all, there were about 1,500 families, totaling roughly 6,000 people who were moved from the plant site in order that the plant might be built. This was done in the national interest, but it had to be a very traumatic experience for those families who could trace ownership of their property back through generations. This shot of a house coming down the road was not unusual back in the 50s when the plant first came.
Yes. Can I ask you if anyone local worked on that project as far as putting Aiken or that site on the map?
Worked on the project?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of promoting that site, if there was any local participation at all, or did that come?
There was local participation, but it was, at the time, it was very, very secret. There were people involved, but they were asked not to discuss it. There was no lobbying for the site per se, because there was no advance notice that there was to be such a plant until after the site had been identified.
So these people had no say-so?
No, that's right. Absolutely correct. At the time of the construction of the plant, it was one of the major engineering undertakings in history. It was a 5-year effort, and in 5 years were built 5 nuclear reactors, 2 chemical separations plants, a heavy water plant, a fuel fabrication plant, power plants, laboratories, 4.5 million square feet of floor space under roof, 83 subcontractors, none of whom had ever bid on a job this size before, and the subcontractors pretty consistently either became rich or went bankrupt, depending on whether they underestimated or overestimated the job. Peak construction force 38,000 people in 1952. Initial cost $1.2 billion. The plant now is worth well over $7 million. Billion. Did I say million? Mm-hmm. Thinking too small again. This is a typical construction safety meeting. Back from in the early days of 1950, late 1951, early 1952 period of plant operation. Somewhere up there is somebody on a podium talking to this mass of humanity before they go out to work, urging them to work safely. It must have worked, because they set a world record for construction hours worked without a disabling injury while they built the plant. This is one of the early shots of the construction site. Again, looks like a mechanized anthill. This happens to be one of the heavy water areas. And here is a reactor going into the ground, 40 feet down. The scope of the plant, of course, is quite large. You've all heard some of these numbers: 300 square miles, 192,000 acres, 10 major areas, about 8,000 DuPont employees, 350 now Department of Energy and other federal employees. The others include the Wackenhut security people and so on, numbering close to 3,000. The total number is crowding 12,000 people. 84 plant budget will be just a little over $1 billion. The plant is very diversified. It includes the entire nuclear fuel chain with the exception of mining and extraction of the uranium. At the plant, we build our own components to fuel the reactors. We have 3 operating nuclear reactors and a 4th which is ready to go online as soon as the environmental considerations can be taken care of. That's L reactor, and I'll show you that in just a minute. We have a heavy water plant. which extracts a fractional percentage of heavy water from the natural occurring water in the Savannah River. This plant is now shut down because we have generated enough heavy water to last for the foreseeable future. We have 2 chemical separations plants which produce the products primarily for the weapons business, and finally we have waste management areas which contain and protect the highly radioactive waste, which is a byproduct of these separations processes. And you've all seen in the newspapers recently the reporting on the Defense Waste Processing Facility, which will be the newest of these waste management areas and also the most effective. One point I would like to make on behalf of the DuPont as a corporation is that, and this is a statement by the board of directors, and the statement reads, DuPont feels a responsibility to support national policy made by duly elected representatives of the people as a good corporate citizen. What this says is basically that DuPont does not take a stand on the need for or deployment of nuclear weapons or other weapons systems, but simply supports the elected government of the United States as that government asks for support. The one exception to this, one thing that the company has lobbied for extensively, is the Defense Waste Processing Facility. DuPont has gone to Washington lobbying for that because it does not want to be in a position of leaving behind at the Savannah River plant radioactive waste that might not be well cared for by another contractor if DuPont should leave the business. It wants to be sure that the radioactive wastes are contained and safely handled at the plant, regardless of what else happens out there. Okay, I've talked a little bit about the background. DuPont, how they got into the atomic energy business, the Savannah River plant, some of the scope, some of the things going on. I'd like to show you a little bit about what went on in L Reactor. Again, this has been in the newspapers, and it may give you a little better feel for what a reactor is and looks like. To begin with, the reactor, and this gets awfully busy, and I'm not going to make nuclear physicists out of you in the next 15 or 20 minutes, but the reactor is a large stainless steel tank which has assemblies hanging down in it, and the water goes in at the top, comes out at the bottom, and this is heavy water, and it's continuously recirculated in this blue loop, okay? It's cooled by heat exchangers which bring water pumped directly from the river into a reservoir, takes the heat out of the heavy water, and goes back to the river. This is what a reactor tank looks like. It's a big stainless steel pot, 21 feet tall and about 14 feet in diameter. You can get some idea of the sizes of the pipes and the pumps by the size of this gentleman down here. The reactor is enclosed in a building. This is ground level here, and the top of the reactor is at ground level. The building goes 40 feet below ground and 150 feet in the air. So what you see when you see these pictures of reactors is only the top 150 feet. As you can see from this, by far the bulk of the building is below ground, including all of the reactor, essentially. Down here we have all our heat exchangers and our major piping, pumps and motors, and the heavy equipment necessary to circulate the water and cool the reactor.
Well, you said 40 feet below?
Yes, 40 feet below.
When you say heavy water, what is the chemical?
Heavy water is water which, like regular water, is H2O. Okay. There is an isotope of hydrogen which is twice as heavy as normal hydrogen, which is called deuterium. Okay, it's an isotope which occurs in nature but very rarely. Okay, when you make water from this isotope, it becomes not H2O but D2O. It happens to have very nice properties in terms of not absorbing neutrons, but slowing them down in the reactor so that the physics works well, and it also cools just as well as H2O. Unfortunately, it is a good deal more expensive.
What's the purpose of putting it below ground?
A couple of things. First, structural. This is massive equipment, and the build of the whole building up on top of the ground would be very difficult to support it. Second, from the safety aspect, if anything did go wrong, if we had a major leak or so on, what would happen would be we'd flood the below ground area. We would not get it out of the building itself. Okay. Let me talk just a little bit about L reactor, a subject near and dear to my heart since I was out there for 3 years. It was built between 1951 and 54. It was the third reactor built, placed on standby in 1968, not because there were problems with it, but because the power levels and the productivity of the other reactors had been increased to the point where it was no longer necessary to meet the demands of the weapon systems. It sat essentially from 1968 until 1980, and in the closing days of the Carter administration, the decision was made to restart the reactor. Funds were authorized and the work began in December of 1980. This is an aerial photograph of L reactor. It doesn't show up very clearly, I'm afraid, but it's one of my favorites because you can see that the reactor was under a cloud. And that's the way it was. At ground level, it didn't look quite that good. This is the water plant. This is why we drank bottled water for the first year out there. Outside facilities looked like this. Fortunately, inside the building, they had maintained temperature control and humidity control in the building. They had left most of the equipment powered up, at least to the individual pieces of equipment, and this is the central control room as it looked when we moved in. It wasn't all that bad. Funding was initially estimated at $214 million. Most of that was capital improvements. These are improvements that were made to the operating areas during the 14 years that the reactor had been shut down. These are primarily improvements aimed at safety and environmental protection. In addition to that money, money was spent to restore unserviceable equipment, and finally wages, salaries, power bills, small tools, and the rest. Total estimate was $214 million. We came in $30 million under that estimate, approximately. We're not, we feel pretty good about that one. This shows the reactor building from ground level early in the rehabilitation program. You notice this tall structure that goes up to the 150 feet above ground. This houses the control and safety rod mechanisms. And in the other areas, subsequent to shutdown of L, flying buttresses were built up to support that in the very unlikely event of a major earthquake. We added those in L, and this shows the iron workers up there 120, 130 feet up, working on the structural steel. And here's the way she looked when the buttresses were complete. Down inside the building, this is a view in the minus 20 elevation. This is 20 feet below ground. And in this area, normally we would have the big heat exchangers that I mentioned earlier. You can get an idea of the size of some of these pipes by the gentleman sitting here straddling welding on this one. It's a monster. See the size of the valves here? It's a little bit larger than you normally find on kitchen sinks and that sort of thing. We had no heat exchangers when we moved into L, and as a result we had to buy 12 new ones.